Okay, so when Dark Souls 2 was released, it was heavily criticized for having a washed out color palette, tiled textures, and a broken lighting system. Well, I've been playing it on the CRT lately, and I went all the way through to the end game without ever really noticing those critiques it received upon release. So I went back to the areas like the Shaded Ruins that I know based upon the Scholar of the First Sin edition on the Xbox One tend to look tiled, washed out, and dull just to double check, and surely enough, complaints weren't applicable. So I ran a few visual tests using different combinations of CRT, rear projection, and LCD displays paired with Xbox One, PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and the PlayStation 2 using Dark Souls 2's vanilla release on the PS3 and the 360, the Scholar of the First Sin update to them on the Xbox 360, and the Scholar of the First Sin re-release on the Xbox One, using Kingsfield 4, Shadow Tower Abyss, and Eternal Ring on the PS2 as a point of reference and baseline regarding observations made on Dark Souls 2 and its supposedly broken lighting. I don't feel it unjustified to disregard the Xbox One re-release for the sake of this discussion, as efforts were made to rectify certain persisting graphical issues within the original release that were applied to the entire game in service to its performance and presentation on modern hardware. So I'm going to focus on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 releases, as the Scholar of the First Sin update didn't come with lighting mechanic fixes, updates, or corrections, and is the definitive vanilla experience. To ask, was the lighting in Dark Souls 2 really broken? Because I don't believe it is. Without getting into the story of Dark Souls 2's troubled development too much, the story ends with the developers scrapping the lighting mechanics they'd been working on due to technical limitations late in development, and the deadline came before they could implement a more basic lighting system across the entire game, leaving over half the game so visually unpolished that it looked nigh unfinished. Like the game engine was doing the bare minimum to display what was needed for the player to interface, because that's exactly what it was doing on an LCD. Now, there's a few things that I've observed that are worth note about the history of FromSoft's development with King's Tower, Soulsborne Ring titles. And it goes back to the PlayStation 2 and their launch title, Eternal Ring. That was a massive step forward technologically from anything that they'd put out on the PlayStation 1, and remains faster paced than later PlayStation 2 titles like Shadow Tower Abyss and Kingsfield 4. Eternal Ring in many ways is prototypical of what modern FromSoft would build upon moving forward technologically. Now, point 2, Demon's Souls, being a PlayStation 3 launch title, was made on a PlayStation 2 development kit, so many of the same tools used to make Eternal Ring were also used in the development of Demon's Souls. And if I recall correctly, Demon's Souls was designed as a traditional From Software dungeon crawler and then reworked into entirely third person to accommodate faster paced gameplay that didn't jive in first person, while replacing all the PS2 low-res development assets with newer HD textures and meshes to utilizing a progressive scan video output of the PlayStation 3 and its increased processing capabilities. Point 3, the PlayStation 2 is the last console made with CRT displays in mind, putting out a 480i video signal and 4:3 aspect ratio, which means there was a degree of reliance on the console's part for the CRT display itself to handle color, depth, contrast, and shading, an effect assisted by the scan lines of the CRT itself that aren't present in HD displays, even with a scan lines overlay a la Castlevania Anniversary Collection. This is one of the reasons the PlayStation 2 translates so poorly to modern displays, whereas the original Xbox and Nintendo GameCube put out in 480i and 720p respectively for progressive scan video signal, making them still look sharp on newer HD displays. Point 4, Dark Souls was made on a dev kit that was updated from what they learned from making Demon's Souls. It's still rooted in PS2 era tools. Multiple videos have been made restoring Dark Souls cut content, and ideas that clearly show dev cycle assets or low-res PS2 era assets that are updated into HD textures and models and meshes after the fact. 5. PlayStation Dark Souls 2 was a very experimental with just how much it could do with the game engine, but it is still rooted in that same basic game engine, with its biggest deviation being its graphical presentation by a new in-house made graphics engine intended to make use of newer hardware and processing power to achieve higher rendering, lighting, and visuals that were traditionally handled by a CRT to generate atmosphere, similar to the way Silent Hill's fog or Shadow Tower's disorientating darkness did. Point 5, Dark Souls 2 had everything clawed back to base and then worked on until the deadline of development came and it went out and such as it was. But just what is the baseline that it was clawed back to? I believe that baseline is, or at least was at the time of Dark Souls 2 release, still rooted in the antiquity of the PlayStation 2's 480i, 60 FPS, 4:3 aspect ratio, but the PlayStation 2 was still made with CRTs in mind, and the PlayStation 2 still leaned on them to handle depth shading, contrast, and lighting, which is part of the reason why the PS2 wasn't prone to the frame stuttering the Xbox had, which processed everything internally. These were all things that were clawed back in Dark Souls 2, and it shows on HD displays that there's nothing there for 60% of the game for a lighting and graphics plugin to really work with, but after 70 hours of it on a good CRT that handles those things instead, I don't think Dark Souls 2 lighting and visuals are broken. I think Dark Souls 2 is a strange anomaly of a PlayStation 3, Xbox 360 sized PlayStation 2 game released for HD consoles as a platform, but optimized by default to look best on an SD CRT. And now I'm really curious just how much better Dark Souls 3 and other Xbox One releases would look like ran through a scaler to scale them down to convert the HDMI signal to component hooked up to a CRT, because Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 look pretty washed out even when the brightness is set low. Okay, so when Dark Souls 2 was released, it was heavily criticized for having a washed out color palette, tile